April 20th, 1999, 11:19 a.m. Two students walked into Columbine High School carrying duffel bags. Inside those bags were weapons that would change America forever. What happened in the next 49 minutes would become one of the most analyzed school tragedies in history. But the survivors who were there that day say we still don't understand what really happened. This is the story of Columbine, told through the voices of those who lived through it. The students who hid in classrooms, the teachers who saved lives, and the investigators who uncovered a plot far more devastating than anyone initially realized. Because what the world thinks happened at Columbine and what actually happened are two very different things. Before we examine this case in detail, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Here at True Crime Vault, we unlock the cases that deserve to be remembered, always with respect for those affected. New investigations every week focused on understanding the truth behind the headlines. Littleton, Colorado, spring of 1999. Columbine High School was a typical American suburban school with approximately 1,100 students. Located in a middle-class community about 13 miles southwest of Denver, it was the kind of place where parents felt their children were safe. The school had won academic awards, had successful sports programs, and was preparing for prom and graduation ceremonies scheduled for the coming weeks. But on the morning of April 20th, 1999, two students had very different plans for that day. Eric Harris, 17 years old, and Dylan Klebold, 18 years old, were seniors at Columbine. To most of their classmates, they seemed like relatively normal teenagers. They had friends, attended classes, went to prom the weekend before. Eric worked at a local pizza shop. Dylan had just been accepted to the University of Arizona. Their parents had no indication of what was about to unfold, but investigators would later discover that the two had been planning an attack for over a year, documenting their preparations in journals, videos, and detailed writings that revealed a plot far more ambitious and deadly than what ultimately occurred. The morning started normally. Students arrived for classes. Teachers prepared lessons. It was a beautiful spring day, just 3 days before Easter weekend. Many students were looking forward to the upcoming prom and the end of the school year. At approximately 11:10 a.m., Eric and Dylan arrived at the school parking lot in separate vehicles. Security footage would later show them getting out of their cars, retrieving duffel bags from the trunks, and walking toward the school cafeteria entrance. They were dressed in black trench coats, which wasn't particularly unusual as they were known to associate with a group of students who wore similar clothing. What nobody knew was that at that exact moment, two 20-pound propane bombs were sitting in the cafeteria, set to detonate at 11:17 a.m. The bombs were hidden in duffel bags placed near the center of the cafeteria, where over 400 students were eating lunch. According to FBI analysis conducted after the attack, if those bombs had detonated as planned, the death toll could have been in the hundreds. The explosion would have brought down the library directly above the cafeteria, where dozens more students were studying. But 11:17 came and went. The bombs didn't explode. Survivors in the cafeteria that day reported that everything seemed completely normal. Students were eating, talking, laughing. One student later recalled checking his watch at 11:18 and thinking about his next class. Nobody had any idea they had just survived what was meant to be a massive explosion. Eric and Dylan had positioned themselves on a hill overlooking the cafeteria entrance, waiting for the bombs to detonate. When they didn't, investigators believe they made a split-second decision. They would proceed with a backup plan, an armed assault inside the school. At 11:19 a.m., the shooting began. The first shots were fired outside the school, in an area near the west entrance. Two students, Rachel Scott and Richard Castaldo, were eating lunch on the grass when Eric and Dylan approached. Rachel was 17 years old, known for her kindness and her faith. She was shot multiple times and died almost immediately. Richard was hit but survived, though he was paralyzed from the waist down. The sound of gunshots sent students and teachers into immediate confusion. Many initially thought it was a senior prank or firecrackers. One teacher who was outside on parking lot duty later described hearing popping sounds and seeing Harris point what looked like a toy gun in his direction. Within seconds, he realized the gun was real. Deputy Neil Gardner, the school resource officer assigned to Columbine that day, was in his patrol car eating lunch when he received a radio call about a female student down in the south parking lot. He immediately drove toward the school, not yet understanding the scale of what was unfolding. At 11:24 a.m., Gardner engaged Eric Harris in a gunfight near the west entrance. Despite exchanging fire, neither was hit. This confrontation, lasting less than a minute, likely prevented Harris from continuing to fire at students who were fleeing in that direction. Gardner's presence forced the shooters to move into the school building. Once inside, Eric and Dylan entered the main hallway. Students and teachers scrambled to lock classroom doors and hide. Teacher Dave Sanders, a business and computer teacher who had been a coach at the school for 25 years, was running through the hallways warning students and directing them to safety when he encountered the shooters on the stairs near the cafeteria. Sanders was shot twice. He managed to make it to Science Room 3, where students and another teacher pulled him inside and began trying to save his life. A student held a sign up to the window saying, "One bleeding to death." For the next 3 hours, as SWAT teams slowly made their way through the building, those students desperately tried to keep Sanders alive. He died at 2:42 p.m. after bleeding out for over 3 hours while help remained outside the building. Let me be clear about something that survivors emphasize when they tell their stories. The police response that day has been heavily criticized, and for good reason. Officers established a perimeter but did not immediately enter the building to confront the shooters or rescue the wounded. This decision, based on police protocols at the time, meant that students and teachers were left to fend for themselves while help remained just outside. The shooters made their way to the library located on the second floor directly above the cafeteria. At 11:29 a.m., they entered the library, where 52 students, 2 teachers, and 2 librarians were hiding under desks. What happened in the library over the next 7.5 minutes would account for the majority of the casualties that day. Survivors from the library describe a scene of absolute terror. The shooters walked among the desks, shooting under tables, taunting students, asking questions. They made statements that would later be analyzed endlessly by researchers and psychologists trying to understand their motivations. One of the most persistent myths about Columbine involves a student named Cassie Bernal. According to widely circulated reports, when asked if she believed in God, she answered yes and was immediately shot. This story became a symbol of faith and martyrdom, and a book was even written about it. But according to multiple witness testimonies and FBI investigation, this exchange likely never happened with Cassie, though it may have occurred with another student, Valine Schnurr, who survived. Survivors stress this point. So much of what was reported about that day was inaccurate. The media created narratives that didn't match what actually occurred, and those false narratives became the accepted truth. Isaiah Schulz, a popular student and athlete, was hiding under a table when he was found by the shooters. According to witness testimony, racial slurs were directed at him before he was killed. Isaiah was 18 years old. His mother later said that hearing the truth about what happened to her son was almost as traumatic as losing him. Kyle Velasquez, 16 years old, was the first to die in the library. He had been sitting at a computer desk and didn't hide when the shooters entered. He was described by his family as a gentle young man who loved computers and making people laugh. In total, 10 people were killed in the library that day. Many more were injured. Those who survived did so by remaining absolutely silent, playing dead, or in some cases, simply through luck, as the shooters walked past their hiding spots. At 11:36 a.m., the shooting in the library stopped. Eric and Dylan left the library and wandered through the hallways. They went back to the cafeteria, where they attempted to detonate the propane bombs that had failed earlier. They shot at them, trying to trigger an explosion. The bombs still didn't detonate. Security footage from the cafeteria shows the 2 shooters walking around, drinking from cups left on tables, throwing small bombs that created minor explosions and fires. One of the more chilling moments captured on camera shows them at the cafeteria serving counter, seemingly casual, as if they were just getting lunch. They returned upstairs and walked through more hallways, occasionally shooting but not engaging with any more students. Investigators believe they may have been waiting for police to enter so they could engage in a final shootout. At 12:02 p.m., Eric and Dylan returned to the library. All of the students who had been hiding there had escaped during the time the shooters were gone. The library was empty except for the bodies of those who had been killed. At 12:08 p.m., both shooters died by suicide in the library. The immediate threat was over, but nobody outside knew that yet. SWAT teams didn't enter the library until 3:22 p.m., more than 3 hours after the shooting had stopped. Students remained hidden in locked classrooms, in closets, under desks, not knowing if the danger had passed. Some students who were wounded in other parts of the building had to wait hours for help. The final toll: 13 people murdered, 24 others wounded, some severely and permanently. hundreds more traumatized, and a nation forced to confront a new reality about school safety. But here's what survivors want people to understand. Almost everything the public thinks it knows about Columbine is wrong. The widespread narrative that emerged in the immediate aftermath painted Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold as outcasts who were bullied and sought revenge on jocks and popular kids. The media reported extensively on the Trenchcoat Mafia, a group of students who wore black trench coats and were supposedly targeted by athletes. Survivors and investigators are clear. This narrative is largely false. Brooks Brown, who was friends with both Eric and Dylan, has spent years trying to correct the record. He states that while bullying existed at Columbine like it does in most high schools, Eric and Dylan were not constant victims of severe bullying. They had friends. They were not complete social outcasts. The idea that they were simply bullied kids who snapped is an oversimplification that misses the actual truth. The FBI's analysis, led by Supervisory Special Agent Dwayne Fusilier, who was one of the lead investigators and also a clinical psychologist, concluded that Eric Harris showed classic traits of psychopathy. His journals revealed a deep hatred for humanity, a desire for fame, and detailed violent fantasies that had nothing to do with bullying. He wrote about wanting to kill hundreds of people, about outdoing Timothy McVeigh's Oklahoma City bombing. Dylan Klebold's journals painted a different picture, a depressed, suicidal teenager who was brought into Eric's orbit. Psychologists who studied his writings note themes of despair and hopelessness, not rage and revenge. Some experts believe Dylan might not have committed violence on his own, but Eric's stronger personality and manipulation drew him into the plan. This matters because the bullied kid seeking revenge narrative led to misguided prevention efforts. Schools focused on identifying outcasts and loners, when in reality, many school attackers don't fit that profile at all. Another crucial point that survivors emphasize: this was not primarily a school shooting. This was an attempted bombing that failed. If the propane bombs in the cafeteria had detonated as planned, the attack would have killed hundreds. The shooting that actually occurred was Plan B, carried out after the main plan failed. Eric Harris wrote in his journal about wanting to create an event that would rival the Oklahoma City bombing, that would be remembered forever. Understanding this distinction changes how we think about prevention. This wasn't a spontaneous act of rage. This was a calculated, planned terrorist attack that took over a year to prepare. The investigation into how Eric and Dylan obtained their weapons revealed significant failures in existing gun laws. 3 of the 4 guns were purchased at a gun show by Robin Anderson, a friend who was 18 years old. She bought them legally because at gun shows, private sellers were not required to conduct background checks. Eric and Dylan, being 17 and 18 respectively, couldn't purchase handguns legally, but Anderson could. The 4th weapon, a Tech DC-9 semi-automatic handgun, was purchased by another friend, Philip Duran, who bought it from Mark Maines. Maines sold the gun knowing it was going to minors. He was later convicted and sentenced to 6 years in prison. Robin Anderson cooperated fully with investigators and was not charged, as she had not broken any laws at the time of the purchase. She has stated in interviews that she deeply regrets her actions and had no knowledge of what Eric and Dylan were planning. The ammunition was purchased over a period of months from various stores, never in amounts that would raise suspicion. Eric had a job and money from his parents. They bought supplies gradually, stored everything in their rooms and a friend's house, and neither set of parents had any idea. This raises one of the most painful questions for the families of Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold. How did they not know? The Harris and Klebold families have largely remained out of the public eye since the attack. Wayne and Kathy Harris moved away from Colorado and have rarely spoken publicly. Tom and Sue Klebold struggled with the reality of what their son had done. Sue Klebold eventually wrote a book titled A Mother's Reckoning, in which she describes her complete shock at discovering Dylan's involvement, her grief for the victims, and her attempt to understand how she missed the signs that something was terribly wrong. Investigators found that both families were typical suburban middle-class households. There was no evidence of abuse or extreme dysfunction. Both sets of parents were involved in their sons' lives. Yet somehow, in Eric's house, his parents never discovered the pipe bombs he was building in his bedroom. In Dylan's house, his parents never saw the sawed-off shotgun hidden there. This terrifies parents everywhere because it suggests that even attentive, caring parents can miss what's happening right under their own roof. There were warning signs, though. A year before the attack, Eric and Dylan were arrested for breaking into a van and stealing equipment. They went through a diversion program, attended counseling, and completed community service. Eric wrote an essay about the experience that seemed to show remorse and growth. His parents thought the arrest had been a turning point that scared him straight. At the same time, Eric was maintaining a website that contained violent writings and threats. One parent, Brooks Brown's father, actually reported the website to police before the attack, concerned about threats Eric had made toward his son. A police report was filed, but no action was taken. A teacher who oversaw a creative video project noticed that Eric and Dylan had made a violent film for class, but chalked it up to teenage edginess and didn't report it as concerning. With hindsight, it's easy to see these as red flags. At the time, they were seen as isolated incidents, typical teenage rebellion, not pieces of a larger pattern. The attack fundamentally changed how schools, law enforcement, and mental health professionals think about prevention. In the immediate aftermath, schools across America installed metal detectors, hired more security officers, and implemented zero-tolerance policies. Students wearing black clothing or who seemed like outcasts were watched more closely. But many of these measures were reactionary and not necessarily effective. One of the most significant changes was in how law enforcement responds to active shooter situations. Before Columbine, the protocol was to secure the perimeter and wait for SWAT. The criticism of the police response at Columbine, particularly the fact that Dave Sanders bled to death while officers remained outside, led to a complete overhaul of active shooter response. Now, the standard protocol is immediate entry and engagement. Officers are trained to move toward the sound of gunshots immediately, forming small teams to confront the shooter even before SWAT arrives. This change has saved lives in subsequent school attacks. Threat assessment became a focus in schools. Rather than profiling students who look a certain way, schools began training staff to recognize behavioral indicators of violence. Students making threats, expressing fascination with previous attacks, acquiring weapons, creating detailed plans. The goal shifted from identifying types of students to identifying specific concerning behaviors. Research into the psychology of school attackers revealed that in most cases, the attacker told someone about their plans beforehand, not adults, but other students. This led to campaigns encouraging students to report concerning statements rather than dismissing them as jokes. See something, say something became a mantra in schools. But survivors of Columbine caution that even with all these changes, we still struggle with prevention. Many subsequent school attacks have occurred despite warning signs being reported. The challenge isn't always knowing something is wrong, it's getting the right intervention at the right time. The survivors of Columbine have each dealt with their trauma in different ways. Some have become advocates for gun law reform. Others speak about mental health and the importance of recognizing depression and violent ideation in teenagers. Some have worked to change the way media covers mass violence, arguing that extensive coverage of attackers inspires copycat events. Patrick Ireland, who was shot twice and paralyzed on his right side, became known as the boy in the window, after news footage showed him falling out of the library window into the arms of SWAT team members. He spent months in rehabilitation learning to walk and use his right side again. He graduated from Columbine on time, went to college, became a financial planner, got married, and had children. He has spoken about choosing not to be defined by the worst thing that happened to him. Casey Rugseger was in the library and was shot, sustaining severe injuries to her shoulder and hand. She underwent multiple surgeries and years of physical therapy. She has spoken publicly about her faith and her journey of healing, both physically and emotionally. Craig Scott, whose sister Rachel was the first person killed that day, was hiding in the library under a table next to two friends who were both shot and killed. He has spent the years since the attack traveling and speaking about Rachel's legacy of kindness and the importance of compassion in preventing violence. Valine Schnurr, who was in the library and may have been the student who actually had the exchange about God that was misattributed to Cassie Bernal, was shot and survived. She has largely stayed out of the public eye but participated in the investigation to set the record straight about what happened. Many other survivors have dealt with PTSD, survivor's guilt, depression, and anxiety. Some have required decades of therapy. Several survivors have spoken about the difficulty of moving forward when the world knows you as a Columbine survivor, as if that one day defines your entire existence. The families of those killed have also walked different paths. Some channeled their grief into advocacy and education. Rachel Scott's family created Rachel's Challenge. a program that promotes kindness and anti-bullying in schools. Dave Sanders' family fought to ensure his heroism was recognized and that changes were made to prevent other victims from bleeding out while help waited outside. Other families chose privacy, finding their own ways to remember their loved ones without public attention. Sue Klebold, Dylan's mother, has tried to promote understanding of mental health issues and suicide prevention, while acknowledging that nothing she does can undo what her son did. She has donated any money from her book to mental health organizations and has expressed her permanent grief not only for Dylan, but for all of his victims and their families. The anniversaries of April 20th bring renewed attention each year, especially on milestone years. Columbine High School still operates, though the library where most of the killing occurred was removed and rebuilt in a different configuration. The school has worked to create a new identity beyond the tragedy, though the history can never be erased. One of the ongoing challenges for Columbine survivors and the community is the phenomenon of Columbiners, individuals who are fascinated by Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold. Online communities exist where people, often troubled teenagers themselves, romanticize the attackers, study their writings, and in some cases express desire to emulate them. This disturbing subculture has led to numerous threats against Columbine High School over the years. In 2019, on the 20th anniversary of the attack, schools across Colorado were closed because of a credible threat from an 18-year-old woman from Florida who was obsessed with Columbine and had traveled to Colorado with guns. She died by suicide before she could carry out any attack. Survivors find this fascination with the killers deeply offensive and dangerous. They emphasize that Eric and Dylan were not misunderstood martyrs or romantic figures. They were individuals who murdered 13 innocent people and traumatized hundreds more. The question of how to remember and memorialize Columbine without glorifying the attackers or inspiring copycats remains difficult. Should we say the attackers' names or refer to them only as the shooters? How do we educate about the event without giving detailed information about their methods? How do we honor the victims without the narrative being overshadowed by the violence of the act itself? There are no easy answers, but survivors generally agree that the focus should always be on the people who were lost, the people who survived, and the lessons that can prevent future violence, not on the mythology surrounding Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold. What survivors want people to understand is that Columbine was not inevitable. This was not a simple case of bullied teens snapping. This was not primarily about access to violent media or Marilyn Manson's music or video games, though all of those were blamed in the aftermath. This was about two teenagers, one likely a psychopath who wanted to commit mass murder and be remembered forever, and another who was deeply depressed and suicidal and was pulled into a plan that ended with catastrophic loss of life. If the bombs had worked, if Eric's original plan had succeeded, the death toll could have been in the hundreds. That it only resulted in 13 deaths is due to the failure of the bombs, not any restraint on the part of the attackers. Understanding this truth is crucial for prevention. We cannot prevent what we don't accurately understand. Focusing on bullying alone won't stop individuals motivated by desire for infamy or driven by psychopathic lack of empathy. Focusing only on access to guns won't address the underlying mental health crises and violent ideation that leads someone to plan mass murder. Survivors emphasize that prevention requires multiple approaches: better mental health support, earlier intervention when concerning behavior is identified, responsible gun ownership and regulation, encouraging students to report threats, training for parents to recognize warning signs, and addressing the way media coverage can inspire copycat events by giving attackers the notoriety they seek. 26 years have passed since April 20th, 1999. An entire generation has grown up in a world where active shooter drills are as common as fire drills. School security has become an industry. The phrase Columbine effect is used to describe the way this event changed American society's relationship with schools and safety. But the survivors who were there that day want us to remember that before it was a cultural touchstone, before it was a case study, before it was a statistic, it was a real event with real people whose lives were forever altered. Rachel Scott was 17 years old. She wanted to be an actress and a missionary. She kept journals full of her thoughts and dreams. On the morning of April 20th, she was eating lunch outside, enjoying the spring weather. She never got to graduate, never got to pursue her dreams, never got to grow old. Dave Sanders was 47 years old. He had coached girls basketball for years, had taught business classes, had daughters and a fiancé. In the final moments of his life, while bleeding from gunshot wounds, he showed pictures of his family to the students trying to save him. He died doing what teachers do, protecting his students. Daniel Rorbo was 15 years old, an aspiring audio engineer who loved working with electronics. Cassie Bernal was 17, known for her faith and her journey from troubled teen to committed Christian. Stephen Kerno was 14, a soccer player who loved Star Wars. Corey DePuter was 17, a golfer and mechanic who was the last person killed before the shooters took their own lives. Kelly Fleming was 16, a writer who aspired to be an architect. Matthew Kechter was 16, a football player with a great sense of humor. Daniel Mauser was 15, an honor student who played in the school band. Isaiah Schulz was 18, a beloved athlete looking forward to graduation. John Tomlin was 16, a car enthusiast and volunteer who dreamed of joining the military. Lauren Townsend was 18, a National Merit Scholar and volleyball captain who had just committed to a university. Kyle Velasquez was 16, a gentle young man who loved computers and making people smile. These were the 13 who died, but Columbine claimed more than 13 lives. It claimed the innocence of everyone who survived. It claimed the peace of mind of every parent sending their child to school. It claimed the simple assumption that schools are safe places. The legacy of Columbine is complicated. The event exposed failures in security, law enforcement response, gun sale regulations, threat assessment, and mental health support. Changes were made in all these areas. Lives have been saved because of lessons learned. But Columbine also opened a door that can never be closed. It proved that mass violence in schools was possible. It created a template that others have studied and attempted to follow or surpass. Despite everything we've learned, school attacks continue to occur with heartbreaking regularity. Survivors emphasize that their experience should serve as a catalyst for continued improvement, not a historical event we study with detachment. They want people to understand that every statistic represents a life. Every case study was a real person with real dreams that were stolen. They want people to know that healing is possible, but it's not linear. That survival comes with guilt and questioning and trauma that doesn't simply go away. That the media narrative often misses the truth. That prevention requires honesty about what actually happened, not comfortable myths that make us feel like we understand when we don't. Today, many of the survivors are in their 40s. They have careers, families, lives that moved forward even as April 20th, 1999 remains a defining date. Some have chosen public advocacy. Others have chosen privacy. All of them carry the weight of that day. The students who hid in classrooms, the teachers who protected their students, the first responders who entered not knowing what they'd face, the families who lost loved ones, and the community that had to rebuild. They all want the same thing, for Columbine to be the last. But it wasn't. And every time another school attack occurs, Columbine survivors relive their trauma, watching another community join a club nobody wants to be part of. If this investigation has given you insight into what really happened at Columbine and why survivor voices matter in understanding school violence, make sure to hit that like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. Have these survivor accounts changed your understanding of what occurred that day? Let me know your perspective. Subscribe to True Crime Vault for more in-depth investigations that go beyond the headlines to understand the truth. We remember not just the events, but the real people whose lives were forever changed. Because Columbine wasn't just a tragedy, it was 13 lives stolen, hundreds of lives altered, and a wake-up call that we're still struggling to answer.